can have functions where the return value of that function depends on the value of one or more variables which are declared outside the functions. Okay. Now, in such situation, a function which whose return value depends on the value of variables which are declared outside the function, such functions are called as closures. Right? So there is a concept called as closures. So simply then functions whose return value depends on a value which is or a variable which is declared outside the function. Okay, so let's look at some example. Right, so let me say I have some value here. So I'll say val multiplier, okay, is equal to, I'll say I of type int, okay, and which is I star 10. So we are creating a variable called as multiplier, okay, and basically we are attaching a value which is a result of a anonymous function here, right? So that anonymous function is taking some parameter, and basically it is returning 10 times that parameter, right? So if you observe here, this is basically a function, okay, val multiplier is a function, okay, which is returning an integer, okay, and which takes in an integer and returns an integer as a function, right? As a return value of this function, okay. Now, supposing if you write it this way, so I'll say val multiplier, okay, is equal to I of int which is equal to I into some factor. Okay. Now, what is happening here? So in this case, the return value of this function is dependent on only one value, that is a parameter that you're passing to this function. Correct? Now, in the second case, we are having the return value dependent on two variables, which is two free variables, which is I and factor. Okay, so one of them, which is I, is a formal parameter to this function. Okay, so I is a parameter to this function. Okay, however, this factor is not a formal parameter, right? So we don't have factor here, right? So it is not part of this function. Okay, then what is it, right? So this is not part of this function. Okay, so now if you see here, this fails, right? Because this is not part of the function. Okay, now I'm going to create a variable here called as a factor, okay, which is equal to, say, some value. Okay, so I have a variable here called as factor, which is initialized with some value. Okay, now if I try to do the same thing, okay, now if you observe, you have a function here. So this function is dependent on two parameters. I mean, so it's not a parameter. It's dependent on two variables. One is actually passed as a parameter, and there is another thing which is not within this function, but this factor is defined somewhere outside. So it is outside this function, right? So the return value of this function is dependent on some variable which is not part of this function. So such situations, such functions where you have the return value dependent on one or more variables which is created outside the function, now they are called as closures in Scala.